Sometimes people think they can measure worth by skin color, by uniforms, or by the size of a paycheck. But one little boy's words, mocked by a cop on a quiet American street, would soon echo louder than the sound of sirens, because when his father finally arrived, the truth didn't just silence laughter, it left the entire crowd breathless. It was a Saturday afternoon in a small suburban neighborhood where kids usually played basketball in driveways and neighbors tended their lawns, but that day the air carried an unusual heaviness as 10-year-old Malik walked to the corner store with a backpack slung over his shoulders, his sneakers scuffing against the cracked sidewalk, his eyes scanning the ground not out of fear but out of habit, because he knew in his short life that trouble often found him even when he wasn't looking for it. And as he pushed the door of the store open to buy a simple bottle of juice and a bag of chips, he noticed a police cruiser parked outside, its lights off but its presence loud enough to draw the attention of anyone with skin like his, so he kept his head down, paid for his things, and walked back out into the sun, only to hear the sharp voice of an officer call out, "Hey kid, what's in the bag?" Malik froze for a second, clutching his purchase tighter, before turning slowly to face the tall white officer with mirrored sunglasses and a smirk that carried more power than politeness. "Just some chips and juice, sir," Malik answered softly, trying to keep his voice steady, but the officer stepped closer, blocking his path. "You sure about that?" "You kids are always up to something," the officer sneered, his hand brushing against his holster as though suspicion alone gave him the right to intimidate, and Malik, his heart pounding, swallowed and repeated, "Yes sir, that's all," before the officer chuckled dryly and shook his head. "You talk like you're hiding something. Maybe I should take a look," and without waiting for consent he yanked the bag from Malik's hands, tearing it open only to find exactly what the boy had said, chips and a bottle of orange juice. But instead of embarrassment the officer laughed as though he had caught the boy in some unspoken crime of existing. "Well, look at that, clean this time," he said, tossing the bag carelessly back, causing the juice to crack against the sidewalk, spilling sticky liquid across Malik's sneakers, and Malik blinked rapidly, fighting the sting of tears. "That was all I had money for," he whispered, but the officer leaned down until his sunglasses reflected the boy's trembling face. "Then maybe next time you think twice before mouthing off," he said, though Malik hadn't mouthed off at all, and just when Malik turned to walk away, gathering the ruined bag into his arms, the officer added, "Where's your daddy anyway? Probably not around, huh?" And the laughter in his tone sliced sharper than the words themselves, but Malik lifted his chin for the first time and replied, "My dad's in the Special Forces," his voice small yet steady, and the moment those words landed the officer threw his head back and laughed, a cruel booming laugh that caught the attention of a couple of passers-by who slowed to watch. "Special Forces," the cop mocked. "Kid, do you even know what that means? Don't lie to me. Boys like you don't have dads like that," and the smirk on his face deepened as if humiliating a child gave him some twisted sense of authority, but Malik didn't back down this time. He simply hugged his broken bag of chips to his chest and said again, "He is, and he's coming home today," and though his voice trembled, there was conviction in it, but the officer only shook his head, muttering under his breath, "Yeah right. Can't wait to see this imaginary soldier," before walking back toward his cruiser, leaving Malik standing there, cheeks hot with shame, the sound of laughter echoing in his ears louder than the cars rolling past, and though he tried to ignore it, that moment branded itself deep into his heart because he knew the cop hadn't just doubted him, he had doubted the honor of his father, the man Malik loved more than anyone, the man who had been gone for months on missions too secret to name, the man whose face Malik kept framed on his bedside table so that even on lonely nights he could whisper, "Good night Dad," into the darkness, and though he was used to people assuming things about him, about his family, about his neighborhood, this time was different. This time it burned, because if there was one truth he carried like a shield it was that his father was a hero, and no one, especially not a laughing cop, could take that away. And as he walked the rest of the way home, leaving sticky footprints on the pavement, Malik clenched his fists and whispered to himself, "You'll see, everyone will see," not knowing just how soon that promise would come true, because fate had a way of delivering justice in ways even a boy could never imagine. Malik reached home with his ruined bag of chips and the faint stain of orange juice still sticky on his hands, and as he stepped inside the small but tidy living room, his mother immediately noticed the look on his face, the way his shoulders slumped even though he tried to stand tall. "What happened, baby?" she asked, rushing over, brushing her hands across his cheeks as though she could smooth away whatever hurt he was carrying. And Malik shook his head at first, not wanting to worry her, but the words tumbled out anyway. "A cop stopped me outside the store, he laughed at me, he said. He said boys like me don't have dads in special forces," and his mother froze for a moment, her lips tightening as though she was swallowing an ocean of emotions. Then she exhaled slowly and pulled Malik into a hug so tight he could feel her heartbeat against his ear. "Don't you ever let someone's ignorance make you doubt who you are or who your father is," she whispered firmly, rocking him gently. "Your dad has put his life on the line for this country, for people who don't even know his name. And nothing, a stranger says can change that truth," and Malik clung to her, breathing in the comfort of her words, but still he couldn't erase the laughter from his mind, that cruel sound echoing again and again until it almost drowned out his mother's reassurance. "He said you were lying, Mom, he didn't believe me," Malik muttered, and his mother gently lifted his chin until his eyes met hers. "Then he'll believe when he sees, won't he? Your father is coming home today, and the world will remember who he is, even if that officer chooses not to," she said with quiet strength, her voice carrying the kind of certainty that Malik longed to hold on to, and for the first time that day, a spark of anticipation lit up his face. "He's really coming home today?" he asked, almost as though he needed to hear it one more time, and she smiled, brushing away the last of his tears. "Yes, baby, today," and those words warmed him more than any sunshine could, because his father's return wasn't just about family, it was about proof, about dignity, about finally silencing the cruel laugh that had followed him down the street. Hours passed with Malik checking the clock every 5 minutes, his small backpack already stuffed with the drawing he had made for his father, an image of them both standing tall under an American flag, hand in hand, a child's lines yet filled with pride. And when the rumble of a military vehicle finally sounded at the end of the street, Malik darted to the window, his breath catching in his throat. "He's here," he shouted, rushing outside before his mother could even grab her phone, and there, stepping out of the vehicle in desert fatigues, tall, broad-shouldered, with the quiet authority of a man who had seen things too heavy to share but carried them anyway, was Sergeant Marcus Johnson, Malik's father, his dark skin glistening under the afternoon sun, his beret tucked neatly under his arm, his eyes scanning the neighborhood until they locked onto the small figure sprinting toward him, arms wide, shouting, "Dad!" Marcus knelt instantly, catching Malik mid-run, lifting him into the air with a laugh that rumbled like safety itself. "There's my soldier," he said, squeezing his boy against his chest, his voice thick with emotion. "I missed you, son," and Malik buried his face into his father's neck, whispering, "I missed you more," but then quickly pulled back, words spilling out. "Dad, you won't believe what happened today. A cop said you weren't real, he laughed at me, he didn't believe you're in special forces," and Marcus's eyes darkened slightly, though his expression stayed calm. "Is that so?" he murmured, setting Malik down gently. "Well then maybe it's time we show him just how real your dad is," and as if fate had timed it perfectly, the same police cruiser rolled down the block at that very moment, the officer from earlier slowing as he noticed the reunion, his sunglasses flashing in the sunlight, curiosity tightening his jaw when he saw Malik pointing directly at him. "That's him, Dad, that's the one," Malik said firmly, his small hand clenching Marcus's strong fingers, and Marcus straightened to his full height, his uniform speaking louder than any badge of the local precinct ever could, and as the cruiser came to a stop, the officer stepped out, his mocking smirk faltering for just a split second before returning. "So this must be the so-called Special Forces, Dad," he said, his tone dripping with condescension as he crossed his arms. "You teaching your boy to make up stories now?" And Malik's mother, who had stepped outside by then, inhaled sharply, ready to defend her son, but Marcus held up a hand, his calm authority silencing the moment as effectively as any order he had ever given his unit. "No, officer," Marcus said evenly, his voice steady yet commanding, "my son doesn't make up stories. I am Sergeant Marcus Johnson, United States Army Special Forces, and I don't appreciate you calling my boy a liar," and though his words weren't shouted, they carried a weight that made the officer shift uncomfortably on his feet, his bravado flickering as he looked Marcus up and down, realizing this man was not bluffing, not pretending, but standing there as living proof of everything Malik had said, and Malik, standing beside his father, lifted his chin proudly, his chest swelling as if he, too, had just been given a uniform, because in that moment he wasn't just the boy who had been laughed at, he was the son of a soldier whose truth was undeniable, and though the officer tried to brush it off with a forced chuckle, muttering, "Well, you can't blame me for being skeptical, kids say all kinds of things," the tremor in his voice betrayed him, and Marcus took one slow step closer, his presence towering, his eyes unblinking. "Skepticism is one thing," he said, his tone firm, "but mocking a child, belittling him, that's something else entirely. You carry a badge, officer, that means you carry responsibility, not just to enforce laws, but to show respect, especially to those too young to defend themselves. My son told you the truth, and instead of listening, you chose to laugh. That's not skepticism. That's arrogance." And the street, which had slowly filled with neighbors drawn by the sight of the military vehicle, grew silent, every eye on the confrontation, every ear waiting to hear what the officer would say next, but for once the man who had laughed so loudly earlier found himself without words, his mouth opening and closing before finally settling into an awkward silence, while Malik clutched his father's hand tighter, whispering under his breath, "I told you he'd see," and Marcus glanced down at his son with a faint smile, pride flickering in his eyes, because this wasn't just about setting the record straight. It was about teaching his boy that truth, backed by honor, always carried louder weight than cruelty ever could. The crowd that had gathered along the street leaned in with hushed anticipation, neighbors who had mowed lawns beside Marcus's house but never truly knew what he did overseas now realizing the weight of his presence, and children who had often played basketball with Malik now looking at him with a new kind of respect, yet Malik's eyes were fixed only on the officer who had mocked him, waiting for some acknowledgement, some apology, but instead the cop shifted uncomfortably, hiding behind his sunglasses as though the mirrored lenses could shield him from the truth staring him down, and Marcus, his voice still calm but carrying the steel of command, spoke again, "Officer, do you know what Special Forces is? Do you know what it means to leave your family for months, to walk into places you can't even pronounce, to wear this flag on your shoulder knowing you may not come back? My boy knows. He's lived every night without me, waiting, praying, holding on to hope. And when he told you who I was, he wasn't bragging, he was clinging to the truth that keeps him strong. And you laughed at him." His words rang across the quiet street, settling heavy in the air, and Malik stood taller at his father's side, his small chest rising with every sentence as though each one stitched back together the dignity that had been torn earlier that day, but the officer, unwilling to fully yield, scoffed under his breath, "Look, I didn't mean anything by it, kids exaggerate. I was just keeping the neighborhood safe," though even as he said it his voice cracked slightly, betraying the thin veil of authority he tried to wrap around himself, and Marcus took another slow step forward, his boots pressing into the pavement with deliberate weight. "Safe? You spilled his drink, humiliated him in public, accused him of lying without cause. That's not safety. That's abuse of power," he said firmly, his eyes locked on the man until the silence between them became unbearable, and for the first time the officer shifted his gaze away, staring down at his shoes as though the cracks in the pavement offered an escape route. Then, almost as if destiny refused to let the moment pass without escalation, another black SUV pulled onto the street, this one bearing the insignia of the military, and from it stepped two more soldiers in fatigues, men Marcus had served alongside, their presence amplifying the gravity of the scene, and when they spotted Marcus they saluted instinctively, their voices ringing, "Welcome home, Sergeant Johnson," drawing gasps from the neighbors and widening the officer's eyes as though he had just been struck, because this wasn't just one man claiming to be Special Forces, this was confirmation from his brothers in arms, undeniable and unshakable. Malik's chest swelled even more, his small hand tugging at his father's sleeve as he whispered, "See, Dad? They believe now," and Marcus bent slightly, his voice low but firm, "Son, belief doesn't come from proving yourself to doubters. It comes from living with honor, whether or not anyone chooses to see it. But sometimes," he added, his gaze flicking back to the officer, "sometimes it's important to confront arrogance so others don't have to suffer it." The officer cleared his throat, finally removing his sunglasses, revealing eyes that for the first time carried something less like mockery and more like unease. "Look. I might have been out of line," he muttered, but Marcus didn't allow the apology to slither away in half-words. He straightened his back, his voice commanding, "Not might have. You were out of line. You mocked a child for speaking the truth about his father, and in doing so, you disrespected not only him but every soldier who serves without recognition. My son deserves better. Every child deserves better." The officer's lips pressed tight as the weight of the crowd's silence bore down on him, whispers rippling as neighbors exchanged looks, some nodding quietly at Marcus's words, others glaring openly at the cop who had just been exposed. Malik's mother stepped forward then, her voice steady yet sharp as a blade. "You made my son cry today. You made him feel small when all he did was speak the truth. You may wear a badge, but today you showed you don't understand the responsibility that comes with it." Her words struck like lightning, and though Marcus had carried the confrontation with military composure, her tone carried the fire of a mother's fury, and the crowd murmured in agreement, shifting closer as though physically placing themselves behind the Johnson family. The officer, cornered by truth and community, shifted again, his bravado collapsing inch by inch. "All right. All right, I get it," he muttered, raising his hands slightly as though surrendering. "I shouldn't have laughed. I shouldn't have said what I did," but even then his tone lacked sincerity, and Marcus caught it instantly, his eyes narrowing. "Apologies without sincerity are just words," he said, his voice lower now, quieter, but with a dangerous edge that carried the memory of battlefields. "If you truly regret what you did, then look my son in the eye and tell him you're sorry. Not me. Him." The officer's mouth tightened, clearly unused to being challenged, especially in front of an audience, but the pressure of silence weighed on him until finally he crouched slightly, his eyes meeting Malik's hesitant gaze. "I'm sorry, kid," he said, the words dragged out like stones across gravel. "I shouldn't have laughed at you, or said what I did," and though the apology was awkward and forced, Malik felt a strange mixture of triumph and relief, because for the first time the officer who had made him feel invisible now had to acknowledge him, had to lower himself and admit wrong, and Marcus, watching, gave his son a small nod, a subtle signal of victory. The crowd, sensing the shift, began clapping softly, a ripple of approval that grew louder, neighbors cheering not for the humiliation of the officer but for the vindication of the boy who had stood firm in his truth, and Malik's heart soared as though the weight of the world had been lifted, but still he whispered to his father, "It doesn't feel like he means it," and Marcus squeezed his shoulder gently, replying, "What matters is not whether he means it. What matters is that you stood your ground, and now everyone knows your truth." And as the officer retreated awkwardly to his cruiser, his posture smaller than it had been earlier, the soldiers stepped closer, one of them clapping Marcus on the back. "You handled that like a true leader, Sergeant," he said, then kneeling to Malik's level, he added warmly, "And you, young man, you handled it like a soldier's son." Malik's face lit up with pride, his father's hand steady on his shoulder, and in that moment, the sting of laughter was finally replaced with the roar of respect, not just from the crowd but from the people who mattered most, his family, his neighbors, and the men who had stood beside his father on battlefields unseen. As the crowd slowly dispersed, conversations buzzing about what they had just witnessed, Malik stayed close to his father, his small hand gripping the rough fabric of Marcus's fatigues as though letting go might make him vanish again, and Marcus, sensing the silent fear beneath his son's proud stance, bent low and whispered, "I'm here now, son, and I'm not going anywhere tonight," his deep voice anchoring Malik in a way no apology ever could, and as they walked back toward their home, neighbors nodded with respect, some clapping Marcus on the back, others bending down to congratulate Malik, telling him, "You did good, kid, real good," and Malik's cheeks flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and pride, because while he had never sought attention, today he had become the center of a truth that demanded to be seen. Inside the house, the scent of his mother's cooking filled the air, collard greens simmering on the stove, cornbread rising in the oven, and for the first time in months their family was whole again, sitting around the table, laughter rising, stories flowing, and though Malik tried to focus on his father's tales, about deserts that stretched farther than the eye could see, about nights where silence was broken only by the sound of distant gunfire, about brothers in arms who watched each other's backs, his mind kept drifting back to the officer's laughter, and the way it had been silenced not by violence but by truth, by presence, by dignity. Later that evening, when the dishes were cleared and the house had grown quiet, Marcus found Malik sitting on the porch steps, his sketchbook open, pencil scratching across the page, and when he peered over his son's shoulder he saw a drawing of the scene from earlier. The officer crouched awkwardly, muttering an apology, while Marcus stood tall behind Malik, and the boy himself was drawn larger than life, his chest puffed out, his head held high, and Marcus felt his throat tighten, pride swelling in his chest as he placed a heavy hand on Malik's small shoulder. "That's a good drawing, son," he said softly, and Malik looked up at him, eyes shining in the dim porch light. "Dad, why do people laugh when they don't believe you? Why couldn't he just trust me?" he asked, his voice small, tinged with the raw innocence of a child struggling to understand cruelty. Marcus sank down beside him, his joints stiff from years of missions and marches, and he thought carefully before answering, "Because sometimes, Malik, people laugh at what they don't understand. They mock what they fear or what they've never experienced. That officer didn't see your truth because it didn't fit the picture in his mind. But you know what? That doesn't make your truth any less real. And it doesn't make you any less strong," and he tapped Malik's chest gently, right where his heart beat. "The strength you showed today, standing tall even when someone tried to make you small, that's the kind of strength no one can take away from you." Malik nodded slowly, taking in his father's words, then whispered, "But it hurt, Dad. It really hurt when he laughed," and Marcus pulled him close, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "I know, son. I know. But hurt can either break you or build you. Today, you chose to let it build you. You didn't back down. You spoke the truth. And that's what being strong is all about." For a while they sat in silence, the warm summer air wrapping around them, fireflies blinking in the distance, and Malik leaned into his father's side, his small body finally relaxing, the day's tension draining away. Soon his mother joined them, carrying 2 mugs of cocoa, setting one in Malik's hands and another in Marcus's, and she sat on the other side of her son, forming a circle of warmth that even the coldest laughter could never break. The next day, news of the confrontation had already spread farther than their street. Neighbors had filmed parts of it, posting the clips online, where comments poured in praising the young boy for his courage and the soldier for his composure, and though Marcus didn't care for internet attention, he recognized what it meant for Malik. The world was seeing his truth, validating the dignity that had been stripped from him, and Malik, scrolling through the comments with wide eyes, whispered, "They believe me, Dad. They really believe me," and Marcus smiled faintly, resting a hand on his shoulder. "They do, son. But remember, you never needed their belief to make it true." Weeks passed, and the incident faded from headlines, but in Malik's heart it remained a turning point, a moment etched into his identity, the day he learned that truth, though fragile in the face of mockery, could be fortified by courage, by family, by the presence of a father who embodied honor. At school, kids who once teased him now asked questions about his dad, their tones curious rather than cruel, and Malik learned to carry himself with quiet confidence, never boasting, but never shrinking either. The officer, perhaps shaken more deeply than he let on, was less visible in the neighborhood afterward, his swagger muted, his laughter no longer echoing so carelessly, and while Marcus never sought revenge, he took satisfaction in knowing the man had been forced to confront his own arrogance. For Malik, the real victory wasn't in the officer's apology. It was in the strength he discovered within himself, the realization that even when mocked, even when doubted, standing in the truth was enough. And years later, when he would look back on that summer afternoon, Malik wouldn't remember only the sting of laughter, he would remember the sight of his father stepping out of that military vehicle, uniform gleaming, eyes steady, presence undeniable, walking into the scene like justice itself, silencing doubt not with anger but with honor. It was the day Malik stopped feeling small. The day a cruel laugh was replaced with a community's applause. The day he learned that being the son of a soldier meant more than pride, it meant carrying dignity, even when the world tried to strip it away. And as the stars spread across the sky that night, Malik whispered to himself, the words soft but steady, "My dad's in the special forces. And so am I, in my own way," and in that whisper was the promise of a boy who had discovered his own strength, the kind of strength that no mockery, no laughter, no arrogance could ever erase. Never let anyone laugh at your truth. Stand tall, because the world will always respect courage in the end. If this story moved you, share it, subscribe, and spread the message of dignity.